I never thought a simple suburban street could turn into a war zone until the day HOA Karen decided to block my sewer line just because my grass was too wild. And as I watched the murky water back up in my yard like some slow-moving horror movie, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years, pure, unfiltered fury, and I knew immediately that I wasn't going to sit there and let her tyranny stink up my life. First, I tried calling her, politely explaining that her enforcement had turned my backyard into a swamp, but she just laughed through the phone, her voice dripping with that smug superiority that only comes from someone who spent decades convincing themselves that being the self-appointed ruler of a suburban kingdom is a legitimate hobby. And that's when I realized words weren't going to work, paperwork wasn't going to work, and the local authorities were too scared, or too lazy, to intervene. So I began planning something far more memorable, something that would make her think twice the next time she decided to play sewer line god over her neighbors, starting with renting an industrial-grade pump, the kind that can suck a small pond dry in minutes, which I positioned strategically at the edge of my property while Karen lounged in her oversized, gaudy armchair in the living room of her mansion, stuffing herself with a ridiculous amount of snacks, her immense frame spilling over the sides as she watched the world with the unearned confidence of someone who believes her money and her HOA title make her untouchable. And as I flipped the switch, feeling the roar of machinery coming alive, I couldn't help but grin at the thought of gravity and municipal plumbing finally serving some justice. The hose snaking across her perfectly manicured lawn like a steel snake, disappearing under her gate and straight into the pit she had thought would humiliate me. And as the first waves of murky, smelly water surged through the hose, I imagined her screaming, the echoes of her entitlement washing away in real time as I watched the pressure build, the sound of gurgling and bubbling like some twisted symphony of revenge, and neighbors peeking out their windows, phones in hand, catching the spectacle as she realized too late that the war she had started was ending in absolute chaos. Her pristine floors now floating in brown liquid, the smell so pungent it made her oversized nose wrinkle, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes, raw and unfiltered. And it gave me a strange thrill knowing that all her smug HOA meetings, all her petty fines and letters threatening lawsuits, all the control she thought she had over the neighborhood, none of it mattered when the law of gravity and physics stepped in as my silent accomplices. And I stood there, covered in splashes from the backwash, dripping and laughing, feeling the power of every ignored complaint, every time she had humiliated me in front of neighbors, all culminating in this glorious, messy symphony of karma as Karen's frantic shouts echoed through the street, mixing with the distant laughter of kids filming the entire ordeal, her minions, equally overweight and bewildered, standing frozen in their driveways, unsure whether to help, flee, or just record the disaster for posterity. And as the pump roared and the liquid crept into every corner of her living room, I realized this was only the beginning, the first salvo in what would become an epic battle between me and the self-declared queen of suburban tyranny, a lesson in chaos, humiliation, and the fact that sometimes the simplest revenge, piping back what was yours, is the sweetest of all. And I knew from that moment forward that HOA Karen would never, ever underestimate me again. The moment HOA Karen realized that my little sewer surprise wasn't just a fluke, that it was a declaration of war, her screams had barely faded when she charged outside in a flurry of panic, her enormous body wobbling comically yet terrifyingly down her driveway, her arms flailing as she tried to grab the hose that was still pulsating with backflow. But I was ready, standing at the edge of my yard like a general surveying the battlefield, grinning as she slipped in the sludge she had created. Herself, her legs tangling, her designer slippers skidding across the lawn like skates on ice, and all around her neighbors were gathering, phones out, capturing every second of her humiliation in high-definition glory, the smell now thick enough to make birds avoid the street and mailmen double back. And just as she finally got hold of the hose, I twisted the valve, sending another sudden surge into her living room that splashed through the walls, up the stairs, and into the hallway where her prized collection of gaudy porcelain figurines toppled over one by one, shattering with sharp, melodramatic cracks that punctuated the symphony of chaos, while I could see the panic in her eyes transform into sheer disbelief. And in that moment, I realized that revenge wasn't just about making her pay, it was about orchestrating a spectacle that the entire neighborhood would never forget. So I ran over to the side of my house where a small industrial fog machine I had secretly installed the night before hummed to life, sending dense, creeping smoke across the lawn, obscuring her view, making her stumble blindly into her flower beds and trample her meticulously arranged petunias, snapping stalks under her enormous weight as I laughed, the sound mixing with the roar of the pump and the gurgling sewer like some perverse rock concert. And then, as if on cue, her cat, a massive Maine Coon she always bragged about, sprang from the bushes, hissing and clawing at her ankles, sending her tumbling once more, now coated in sludge and petals, while I discreetly released a few of my own trained frogs I had caught earlier from my backyard pond, which hopped into her waterlogged living room, adding layers of panic as she tried to scoop them out only to slip again on the slippery wooden floors, her cries escalating to pitches no human should ever produce, echoing down the street like an operatic wail of humiliation, while her neighbors, many of whom had suffered under her petty fines and surveillance for years, now whispered and pointed, some cheering silently, others capturing footage for what was clearly going to go viral, and I didn't stop because revenge at this scale required escalation, so I pulled out a long extension cord and powered my old leaf blower, aiming it at the open door and the rising smoke, creating a tornado-like swirl that lifted the smell of sewage and fog into the air, forcing her to retreat back inside only to find that the sludge had crept under her cabinets, puddled in the corners, and dripped down her pristine white walls, while her expensive rug collection, hand-picked and overpriced, was now saturated, staining patterns forever, and as she scrambled with towels and mops, slipping again and again, she realized that this wasn't just about property damage. This was psychological warfare, a full-scale demonstration of what happens when a suburban tyrant underestimates the quiet neighbor she tormented for years, and from my vantage point, I could see her HOA minions arriving in a panic, their faces red with both exertion and embarrassment as they tried to help, only to slip and slide in the sludge themselves, turning the street into a chaotic, grotesque ballet of flailing limbs, tripping bodies, and futile attempts to contain the mess, while I calmly sipped my iced tea, relishing the layers of irony that each of them, the self-proclaimed enforcers of neighborhood rules, were now entangled in the consequences of their own arrogance. And I knew then that this wasn't just revenge. This was performance art, a lesson in humility delivered in waves of brown liquid, fog, and amphibians. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting dramatic shadows over the scene, Karen's screams now mixed with muffled sobs, the sound of breaking furniture, and the distant laughter of children capturing every angle, I realized that the story I had created would ripple through HOA history, whispered about in meetings, screenshot on social media, dissected in private texts, a perfect storm of chaos engineered by a single determined neighbor who refused to be bullied, and I felt a thrill knowing this was only Act 2 of the saga, that each surge of revenge, each escalation of humiliation, would bring her closer to the edge of both sanity and social respect. And as I looked at her drenched, broken, flailing self inside her own home, I smiled, because she had finally discovered the most important lesson of all. When you play petty games with your neighbors, especially ones who are smarter, sneakier, and infinitely more vindictive than you imagined, the consequences are explosive, messy, and unforgettable, and from this moment forward, every time she looked out her windows at my calm, dry, and victorious yard, she would remember the day her arrogance met its messy, hilarious, and perfectly engineered downfall. Just when I thought HOA Karen had reached peak humiliation, I realized the real fun was about to begin, because while she was frantically mopping, cursing, and slipping in the sludge that now covered her floors like a brown carpet from hell, I had already moved on to phase 3 of my revenge, and the first sign of this new phase hit her like a thunderclap when I drove a small rented fire truck down the street, lights flashing, siren wailing, but instead of extinguishing flames, I had filled the truck with more of the industrial pump water mixed with biodegradable but extra viscous colored dye. So every splash inside her house would turn an already horrifying scene into a psychedelic disaster. And as I parked it with theatrical precision, the neighborhood kids screamed with delight, phones recording in every possible angle, while HOA Karen, now utterly panicked and sweating under her oversized, floral-patterned housecoat that did nothing to hide her massive frame, stared at me like I was some kind of suburban superhero or villain depending on perspective, and in a frenzy she tried to call for backup, but her phone slipped from her hands as she bent over to rescue a toppled lamp, bouncing off her ample curves, and hitting the wall with a crack that sent her into a new spiral of panic, while her overweight HOA minions scrambled to help, slipping and sliding in the sludge, knocking over furniture, colliding with each other like cartoon characters in slow motion, and I could hear her yelling something about lawsuits and this is illegal, but the words were drowned out by the roar of the pump, the siren, and the gurgling tsunami of sewage she had created herself, now being funneled through hoses and nozzles into every room she had ever claimed as her domain, and I had to admit, the sight was cinematic perfection. Her ornate chandelier swinging precariously from the ceiling, dripping with water and sludge, the walls streaked with brown and purple dye, her cat now perched on the top of a shelf, hissing at anything that moved, and her dog, a fat, lazy bulldog she adored, barking furiously, slipping and tumbling into the chaos, adding an extra layer of absurdity to an already surreal scene. And just when I thought she couldn't possibly get any more humiliated, I activated a hidden speaker system I had set up the night before, blasting the sound of rushing water, screams, and frogs croaking in perfect unison, a psychological assault that made her stumble backward into a pile of shredded decorative pillows, her body hitting the floor with a thud that echoed down the street, while I watched from my yard, grinning like a maestro conducting the symphony of destruction, and I had to chuckle at the poetic justice. Every fine she had ever issued, every petty complaint she had ever filed against me, every time she had strutted around like a self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, it all came crashing down in a mix of sludge, dye, fog, amphibians, and chaos, and her neighbors, many of whom had suffered quietly under her tyranny for years, now peeked out of windows, some cheering, some recording, all witnessing the total collapse of Karen's reign, and as she scrambled to her feet, flailing, stepping into puddles of dye that stained her expensive slippers, she tried to shout orders at her minions, but their coordination had long since evaporated, leaving her alone in the maelstrom she had helped create, the colors swirling around her like some apocalyptic kaleidoscope, the smell thick and pungent, forcing even the bravest neighbors to retreat indoors, and I, taking a dramatic step forward, raised my arms as if to claim victory over a conquered kingdom, watching her massive body stumble, her face a mixture of terror, disgust, and disbelief, realizing that her control, her arrogance, and her inflated sense of power were now completely annihilated, and as I flicked the switch to release one last surge through the hoses, sending the sludge back into her bathrooms and bedrooms with precise, devastating accuracy, I could see her scream, slip, and scramble simultaneously, the sound of porcelain shattering, floors squelching, and her own voice rising in pitch to an almost cartoonish level, and I knew that this moment, this glorious, chaotic, perfectly orchestrated revenge, would go down in neighborhood lore, whispered about in HOA meetings, texted in gossip threads, and replayed endlessly on social media, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could wield petty authority over their neighbors without consequences. And as I stepped back to admire the artistry of my work, the sun setting behind me casting a dramatic golden glow over the now carnage-strewn lawn, I felt a deep satisfaction, because HOA Karen had finally learned a lesson she would never forget. Never, ever underestimate the quiet neighbor who is willing to escalate beyond imagination. And while she sat drenched, dye-covered, and muttering to herself, her minions scattered and slipping, her cat perched atop the chaos, and her dog whining, I knew this was only the beginning, the middle act of a long, glorious opera of revenge that would continue to crescendo until she had no dignity, no control, and no choice but to acknowledge that the suburban kingdom she ruled with arrogance was now mine to mock, and every flailing, screaming, slipping moment only made the victory sweeter, more cinematic, and utterly unforgettable for anyone lucky, or unlucky, enough to witness it. The real collapse of HOA Karen didn't begin with the smell or the stains or even the screaming. It began the instant the emergency sirens echoed down the street and she realized the entire neighborhood, and now the authorities, were about to witness the consequences of her arrogance, because as flashing lights painted the houses red and blue, she stood frozen in her ruined doorway, hair wild, clothes soaked, eyes darting between the destruction inside her home and the crowd forming outside, and for the first time since she crowned herself ruler of this block, she looked small, exposed, and utterly powerless, while I stood calmly across the street, hands in my pockets, watching the performance reach its crescendo, knowing full well that everything unfolding now was the direct result of her decision to weaponize the HOA against me, and as firefighters approached, noses wrinkling at the smell wafting from her house, she began shouting over herself, contradicting every sentence, blaming me, blaming the city, blaming unauthorized plumbing modifications she herself had ordered months earlier, and that's when the truth started unraveling because the more she talked, the more she revealed, admitting without realizing it, that she had instructed a contractor to cap my sewer access temporarily to pressure me into compliance, words that caused the crowd to murmur and phones to rise higher, capturing every syllable, and as officials entered her house to assess the damage there, boots squelching on soaked floors, the expressions on their faces shifted from confusion to concern to outright disbelief, because what they saw wasn't vandalism or sabotage, but a catastrophic backflow caused by deliberate obstruction, documented in HOA emails, work orders, and text messages that I calmly provided when asked, printed and neatly organized, while Karen paced the lawn, spiraling, shouting about fines and authority and respect, none of which mattered now because the power dynamic had flipped completely, and suddenly she wasn't the enforcer. She was the liability, and as inspectors explained in painfully clear language that blocking a private sewer line violated multiple municipal codes, health regulations, and civil protections, her face drained of color, her voice dropping to a whisper as the weight of consequences finally settled in, while neighbors, those she had bullied, fined, embarrassed, and threatened for years, watched in stunned silence as her empire collapsed. Not with a bang, but with paperwork, evidence, and undeniable truth. And when the fire chief ordered the house temporarily evacuated due to contamination risks, Karen let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, clutching at her ruined belongings, while officials placed warning tape across her door like a seal of judgment. And in that moment, standing there with the smell still lingering in the air and the crowd buzzing with whispered justice, I felt something shift, not triumph exactly, but vindication, the kind that comes when you don't just win, you're proven right, because this wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about exposure. About showing that power abused eventually turns inward and destroys itself. And as Karen was escorted to the curb, wrapped in a blanket, muttering about conspiracies and disrespect, the neighborhood finally exhaled, a collective release of years of silent frustration. And I knew then that this wasn't the end, it was the reckoning, the moment the story crossed from chaos into consequence. And as the lights faded, the crowd dispersed, and Karen sat alone on the curb staring at the wreckage of her own making. I walked back into my house, closed the door, and smiled, because the queen of compliance had just been dethroned by her own rules, and the next chapter would be far worse for her than anything sewage could ever do. The real punishment didn't come with sirens or sludge or shouting. It came quietly, methodically, and far more devastatingly the moment the paperwork started circulating, because while HOA Karen sat at home in temporary lodging, stewing in humiliation and convinced she could still bully her way out of the mess, the machinery of consequences began grinding forward without her permission, and I watched it unfold with a calm satisfaction as notices appeared on doors, emails flooded inboxes, and the once feared HOA board suddenly scrambled like ants whose hill had been kicked apart, because inspectors didn't just cite the sewer obstruction. They expanded their investigation, uncovering years of unauthorized modifications, selective enforcement, misused funds, and intimidation tactics that neighbors had been too afraid to report until now. And suddenly everyone had a story, everyone had receipts, photos, recordings, warning letters, bogus fines, and threats signed with Karen's name, which now looked less like authority and more like a confession. And as meetings were called, emergency meetings, packed meetings, meetings held in borrowed spaces because the HOA office was locked pending audit, Karen tried to reassert control remotely, sending furious emails filled with capital letters and legal threats. But they landed flat, mocked, forwarded, screenshotted, because the fear she once inspired had evaporated, replaced by anger and a strange collective courage. And when the city issued formal findings confirming deliberate obstruction of a private sewer line, the tone shifted completely, because that wasn't petty HOA drama anymore. That was liability, health risk, and negligence, words that make lawyers salivate and insurance companies vanish. And as her insurer denied coverage due to intentional acts, the reality finally hit her like a delayed explosion, leaving her pacing, spiraling, blaming everyone except herself, while outside her influence collapsed brick by brick. Neighbors forming a coalition, voting to suspend her powers, freezing accounts, and initiating a recall she never believed possible, and I watched her downfall play out in real time through leaked emails and frantic voicemails, her voice cracking, swinging wildly between rage and desperation, offering deals, threatening countersuits, promising reforms, anything to claw back relevance. But the crowd had moved on, because once people see the truth, they don't unsee it, and the public humiliation was complete when a local news segment picked up the story, not for drama, but as a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA authority, showing blurred footage of inspectors, warning tape, and a blurred silhouette of Karen shouting from behind a door, her name omitted but unmistakable to anyone who lived within 5 miles, and suddenly she wasn't feared, she was infamous, the example whispered about at block parties and group chats, the story people told with raised eyebrows and disbelief. And as the HOA's attorney resigned, the board fractured, and the association itself faced dissolution, I felt something deeper than victory settle in, because I hadn't just beaten Karen, I had exposed a system that let people like her thrive. And when the final notice arrived stating that the HOA was officially under receivership pending restructuring, I placed it neatly in a folder alongside the original sewer work order she had signed months earlier, the document that started everything. And I realized the most poetic part of it all wasn't the mess or the chaos or even her downfall. It was that she did it to herself slowly, confidently, believing power made her immune, until the day she learned that power without accountability always rots from the inside. And as I looked out over a quieter, calmer street, neighbors waving instead of whispering, rules being discussed instead of imposed, I knew the storm was almost over, and that the final act wouldn't be loud or messy or dramatic. It would be permanent. The true ending of HOA Karen's reign didn't arrive with shouting or spectacle but with the slow, crushing silence that follows absolute defeat. Because weeks after the investigation began and the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm, the final determinations came down in a way that left no room for denial, no loopholes to exploit, and no authority left for her to hide behind. And I remember the morning it happened clearly, the street unusually quiet, birds louder than traffic, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. When certified letters arrived at nearly every house, outlining the city's findings, the dissolution process, and the permanent restrictions placed on the former HOA leadership, and as neighbors stepped outside reading the same words I was, expressions shifting from disbelief to relief to something like disbelief again, it became clear that this wasn't just the end of Karen's power, it was the end of an entire era of fear that had shaped daily life here. 4 years because the report was thorough and merciless, listing intentional infrastructure interference, abuse of authority, selective enforcement, retaliation against residents, and reckless endangerment, all tied together by documentation that Karen herself had signed or sent. And the irony of it all was almost unbearable, because she had always believed paper was power, that forms, fines, and warnings made her untouchable, when in reality they became the very evidence that dismantled her. And as the city placed the HOA under permanent external administration with strict limits, banned any former board member from holding authority again, and opened the door for civil recovery by affected residents, the neighborhood collectively realized that this wasn't temporary justice. It was structural, irreversible, and as days passed, Karen faded from public view entirely, no longer seen pacing her yard or peering through windows, rumors circulating quietly that she had listed her house. That insurance wouldn't cover the damage, that legal fees had piled up faster than she could threaten anyone, and while I never sought confirmation, I didn't need it, because the evidence of her absence was everywhere. In the absence of warning letters taped to doors, in the silence of once constant emails, in the way kids now rode bikes freely without being chased off for imaginary violations, in the way neighbors lingered outside talking instead of rushing indoors, and the most powerful moment came not in a courtroom or meeting but at a community gathering organized by people who had never dared organize anything before, where stories were shared openly for the first time, where people laughed about things that once terrified them, where neighbors admitted how small they had felt under rules that were never really about order but control. And as I listened, I realized something important. This story was never just about me or Karen or even the sewer line, it was about what happens when unchecked authority meets someone who refuses to stay silent, because every system that relies on fear collapses the moment someone pushes back with facts, patience, and persistence. And as the new administration removed signs, rewrote guidelines, and returned control to residents, the street itself seemed to change, houses brighter somehow, porches used again, gardens planted without fear of citations. And on one quiet evening, as I stood outside watching the sun dip behind rooftops that once felt oppressive, I felt a calm satisfaction settle in that no act of revenge could ever deliver, because I hadn't just survived Karen's abuse, I had outlasted it, exposed it, and helped end it for everyone else. And when months later a moving truck finally pulled up to her house and quietly loaded what remained of her belongings without ceremony or audience, no one cheered, no one filmed, no one needed to, because her power was already gone, erased not by noise but by consequence. And as the truck drove away and the street returned to silence, I knew the story was complete, not because someone lost but because a neighborhood finally won back its peace, and the lesson left behind was simple and permanent. Authority without accountability always collapses, and when it does, it takes the ego of those who abuse it down with it, leaving space for something better to grow in its place. What people never understand about the aftermath of power is that it doesn't explode, it evaporates, and the day HOA Karen finally vanished from the neighborhood wasn't announced with sirens or court dates or headlines. It was marked by the absence of her voice, her emails, her rules, and her constant need to be seen, because weeks after the receivership finalized and the last of the legal notices were archived, something subtle but profound began to settle over the street, a kind of reclaimed normalcy that felt foreign at first, like living in a house after a long, loud generator finally shuts off and you suddenly realize how quiet peace actually is. And I noticed it in the way people stopped checking over their shoulders before doing ordinary things, in how lawns grew imperfectly again without fear of citations, in how neighbors who had lived 10 feet apart for years finally spoke to each other without whispering. And the most ironic part was that Karen had always claimed she was protecting property values, Yet the day she disappeared was the day the street felt valuable again, because value isn't manicured hedges or identical paint shades, it's safety, dignity, and the freedom to exist without being monitored by someone who mistakes control for leadership. And as months passed, her name stopped being spoken entirely, not out of politeness but out of irrelevance, because once people reclaim their agency they don't keep monuments to their oppressors, they move on, and the story that once dominated group chats and late-night conversations slowly compressed into a single sentence people would say to newcomers if it ever came up. Something like, "Yeah, there used to be an HOA mess here." And that was it, no dramatic retelling, no obsession, because the power she craved most was attention, and starvation is the cruelest punishment for someone who lives to dominate. And every so often I would see a moving truck parked briefly at a house she once fined relentlessly. New families settling in unaware of the history beneath their feet. And I realized that this was the truest form of victory, not watching someone fall, but watching life continue as if they never mattered at all, and the neighborhood itself transformed in ways no rulebook ever could, because people began taking responsibility instead of orders, resolving disputes with conversation instead of complaints, understanding that order enforced through fear always fractures while order built on respect sustains itself, and standing there one evening watching kids ride bikes freely across driveways that once might have triggered warnings, I thought about how Karen had believed she was untouchable simply because no one had challenged her before, and how that illusion had sustained her far longer than competence ever could, because most tyrants aren't powerful, they're just uncontested, and once someone finally stands still long enough to say no, to document, to wait, to let arrogance overplay its hand, the collapse becomes inevitable. And what struck me most was that I hadn't needed to outshout her, out-threaten her, or out-bully her. I had simply refused to bend, refused to disappear, refused to let her rewrite reality unchecked. And that refusal alone had forced her to escalate until she exposed herself completely. And that's how authority built on ego always dies, not from rebellion but from excess. Because people who crave control can't stop themselves from overreaching, and when they do, they sign their own ending. And as the seasons changed and the street settled into something quieter, softer, and stronger than before, I realized that the entire ordeal had left behind an unspoken lesson everyone understood without needing to say it aloud. A shared understanding that power exists only as long as people consent to it, that rules mean nothing without fairness, and that the most dangerous thing you can underestimate is someone who knows the system well enough to let it destroy you when you abuse it. And on the rare occasion someone would ask me how it all ended, I just say it didn't end loudly, it ended permanently, because the true finale wasn't her downfall, it was our freedom, and that kind of ending doesn't need applause, it just needs time to prove it was real. The final chapter didn't announce itself the way people expect endings to, because real endings rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They feel inevitable, like gravity finally catching up to something that's been floating on arrogance for far too long. And the day I truly understood that HOA Karen's story was over came not when she left, not when the HOA dissolved, not even when the neighborhood healed, but months later when I realized I no longer felt anything about her at all, not anger, not satisfaction, not curiosity, just nothing, and that emptiness was the most definitive proof of victory imaginable, because power-hungry people survive on reaction, on resistance, on being the center of someone else's emotional universe, and when that evaporates, they don't just lose authority, they lose identity, and by then the neighborhood had rewritten itself entirely, not through rules or enforcement but through quiet consensus, neighbors handling issues face-to-face, compromises replacing complaints, laughter replacing surveillance, and I watched people who had once been timid and cautious grow confident again, not reckless, not careless, just human, reclaiming the right to exist without permission, and what struck me was how little effort it took once fear was removed, because fear had been the real infrastructure all along, not bylaws or committees, and when it collapsed everything else followed, and occasionally I would hear distant updates about Karen through secondhand murmurs, nothing concrete, nothing dramatic, just fragments that painted a picture of someone still trying to assert importance in places that no longer listened, still clinging to titles that meant nothing, still convinced the world had wronged her instead of understanding that it had simply moved on. And there is a particular cruelty in being left behind by time itself, because time doesn't argue, it doesn't justify, it doesn't punish loudly, it just continues without you, and that continuation is unbearable to people who believe they are essential. And as years passed, the story faded even further, not erased but archived, becoming one of those strange neighborhood legends that sound exaggerated to new residents until they realize how quietly serious it was, how close things came to lasting damage before accountability finally intervened. And standing there one afternoon watching a block party fill the street with music and voices that once would have drawn warnings and citations, I understood something deeper than revenge or justice, something almost philosophical, that authority only exists where people agree to carry it, that systems rot fastest when no one questions them, and that the most effective resistance isn't rage or chaos but patience paired with documentation, persistence paired with restraint, because the system that enabled Karen also recorded her, preserved her decisions, time-stamped her arrogance, and eventually presented it back to her. Without emotion, and that was the true irony, that she trusted systems because she believed they served her, never realizing they were neutral mirrors waiting for her to overexpose herself. And as I looked around at a street that now functioned better without imposed control than it ever had under it, I realized that this wasn't just the end of one person's dominance, it was a quiet lesson etched into the community's collective memory, a reminder that power unchecked will always escalate until it collapses, that silence isn't weakness when it's strategic, and that the most lasting victories don't announce themselves, they settle in and become normal. And when night fell and the lights came on across houses that no longer felt monitored or judged, I felt a calm certainty that this story would never repeat here, not because rules were tighter but because people were awake now and that awareness was permanent. And if Karen ever thought about this place again, if she ever wondered how it ended, the truth would be unbearable for her to accept, because it didn't end with her being defeated, it ended with her being unnecessary, and that is the one ending no tyrant ever prepares for.